My own evolution, just to be clear, is I regard myself first and foremost as a human rights activist in the area of drug control. And that I come to this, although I will make all of the arguments for reforming drug policy, the economic arguments, the health arguments, the criminologic arguments, all of the arguments, ultimately what drives me more than anything is this basic human rights element. And making the case, as I will at the Oslo Freedom Forum on Wednesday, that this is a pivotal human rights issue is not my focus today, but it is personally where my background is. I have been working in this area now for almost 30 years. In my early years in graduate school, I was able to, my dissertation was on the internationalization of crime control. And so I was able to talk my way into the US State Department and to get a security clearance, so I would have access to secret materials. I interviewed drug enforcement agents, both for the US DEA, our federal drug enforcement agency, and others all through Latin America and Europe. And I wrote first one book, Cops Across Borders, about that, about the internationalization of US criminal law enforcement, about the question of how US law enforcement operates when it needs to get information or evidence for the court or bodies, the fugitives, the people they're targeting, how they deal with different cultures, different laws in Europe, how they deal with the problems of corruption in Latin America. And then some years ago wrote a second book with a colleague, Peter Andreas, called Policing the Globe, to try to look at how the evolution of crime control happened globally, right? Well, how and why does crime control, the efforts to work with crime, how are they coordinated? What conflicts happen? My background was in law and also in politics, international relations. But for most of these years, I have been an activist, first within the university, and then creating what's now the leading organization in the US and probably the world of people who advocate for a different way. Most of my work is within the United States, but at various times, and especially now, I have been very involved on the international front, especially in Latin America. Now, to put this in historical perspective, and to talk about sort of the 20th century approach and the 21st, what I hope will be the 21st century approach. The 20th century was really the period of the evolution of what might be called the global drug prohibition regime. The global drug prohibition regime. By which I mean a regime, a global system enshrined in international conventions. This is the 100th anniversary of the first anti-drug convention in The Hague in 1912, special year. It was one which is now in international conventions of 1930s, and then 1961, and 1971, and 72, and 88, the international conventions, with a UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and a UN International Narcotics Control Board, and there's international institutions. It is, in addition, the laws of basically every country in the world today has a prohibitionist drug control system. Even the most progressive, the Dutch, the Swiss, it is essentially a drug prohibition system, whereby certain drugs, not alcohol, not tobacco, but the other drugs, the other psychoactive drugs, are part of a prohibitionist control system. In addition to having the international convention, in addition to having the national laws in every country, there are also the state laws, and in some places the local laws. And then in addition, there is the mindset that believes of people all around the world that, of course, these drugs are illegal, forgetting that there was ever a time when they were not illegal. The assumption that these laws to criminalize these substances are almost like the laws against murder and rape and other violence and other predatory crime, that they are almost natural laws, right, that they must be. For many people, the notion that if you think almost to some extent the evolution of criminal law in most of our open societies, in most non-theocratic societies, the evolution with the Enlightenment over the last few hundred years has essentially been to relegate the criminal law more and more to narrowing the criminal law to those activities that involve harm to others, right? I mean, violence and predatory crime, right? And if you look at the criminal codes from 200 years ago in my country and most others, the criminal codes were not just against violent crime and predatory crimes, crimes of theft, but they were also all of the old biblical and religious crimes, which became part of the secular criminal codes. But the evolution has been that those other ones shall mostly be removed from the criminal code, right? And what we're left with, of course, and there are still the laws regarding sex work and prostitution, but in many countries there is some balance and some elements are legal. But there's one activity, right? This activity of the production and the distribution and the purchase and the possession and the use of these drugs, in which it is not necessary to establish any harm to another human being to find that person guilty of a crime and to take away their freedom for days, weeks, months, years, or in many countries, decades, right? If I look in the American jail and prison system, you know, you have people there for the violent crimes, the predatory crimes, and then you have the drugs. For people locked up for producing, growing, selling, not to children in most cases, but to other adults, right? And that assumption, that global assumption, right, is just become part of the global mindset. In a way, it almost became a sort of, like the global secular faith. It was governments that agreed on nothing could agree on this. You know, I think I remember when right before Nixon, President Nixon went to China in the early 1970s. How did they break the ice? Americans sent people to play ping pong, right? You know, ping pong, and because everybody plays ping pong, it was something. It was not. Well, in a respect, the drug war was like ping pong, right? It was something that if the United States and Gaddafi in Libya, or Castro in Cuba, needed to find one thing that they could make nice with one another, if they didn't play ping pong, we could agree on the drug war, right? Drug war was our global secular faith. We all can agree, a global consensus, right? Now, in thinking about this back in my academic days, I asked the question at one point, what else is like this? In some respects. And I came up with something. I published this article called Global Prohibition Regimes, the Evolution of Norms in International Society. I published it in a journal called International Organization, 2 decades, 1989 or 1990. And I asked 2 questions there. The first question is, why and how is it that certain activities that are regarded as more or less legal or not illegal all around the world become criminalized all around the world? And not just criminalized, but the subject of global prohibition regimes. And the second question I asked is, why is it that in some cases the global prohibition regimes that emerge are successful in more or less eradicating the activity that they were aimed at, and in other cases, they are failures? And the first global prohibition regime, I think, that emerged was the one against piracy and privateering, right? That was something where hundreds of years ago, piracy, privateering, if you came from another nation or empire, that's what you did. And if then, if then at some point, countries had a conflict, then a pirate would become a privateer, basically a government licensed pirate, right? But at some point, there's abolition of this notion that the high seas are free ground, that anybody can target. And this happens in part, I explain why, it happens in, for reasons of politics, the power of the imperial powers saying we will no longer, our interest is now in peace. It happens for economic interests, right? But it also happened, I argued, for what might be called cosmopolitan notions of human rights. An evolving notion beginning some hundreds of years ago that human beings have some inherent rights, regardless if they speak a different language or a different color or a different nation. The second area was the prohibition on slavery and the slave trade. 300 years ago, of course, slavery was part of the tradition almost everywhere. But at some point, you have the abolition first of the slave trade, and then of slavery. And once again, you have the role of political interests, of economic interests, but also, especially coming from Britain, a profoundly moral notion, right? I mean, this notion that slavery is wrong, that it is wrong. And actually, that sort of cosmopolitan moral notion plays a powerful role in the evolution of the global prohibition on slavery, right? And then the next one, in a way, is the drug one, right? What emerges at the beginning 100 years ago, driven by my government more than any other, is this notion that we need a global prohibition regime, right, to ban these things. And that comes about, once again, for political reasons. There's a competition between the United States and England over China. China has the historical trauma of the Opium Wars. It's a way, there are economic reasons. And there is also, as always is necessary, a powerful government, my government, driving this forward. And also, there was a term I combined from two distinguished academic traditions, the term transnational moral entrepreneurs, right? There was a notion, was it moral entrepreneurs from one of the sociologists, was it Becker? Or I can't remember, Becker or Gusfield, comes up with the notion of moral entrepreneurs, people who are entrepreneurs in promoting moral notions, for better or worse, right? And the notion of a transnational moral entrepreneurs who operate beyond their borders, sometimes associated with government, sometimes beneath that level. But my government becomes the principal advocate of a global prohibitionist regime. Now, just to finish off the theory, I look then, what else besides piracy and slavery and drugs? Well, you had the quote-unquote white slave trade, the sex traffic, which is now re-emerging as an important issue, and which once again is a very complicated area where the role of prohibitionism cuts all sorts of ways, right? And that one did not go very far, right? And in all of these cases also issues of class and race are inevitably woven into what is happening and who is being targeted. And then if you come right to the present, you look at, for example, the movement to ban the killing of whales and elephants and endangered species, right? Moral notions linking to political and economic interests, creating new regimes. Now, most of these global prohibition regimes, I would say, were mostly beneficial, were good things, right? There was a sense of combining against the evil, piracy, slavery, killing of these other species, the drug thing. While it was driven in part by the notion that these substances could be dangerous and needed to be controlled, the fact that it became part of a prohibitionist control system was oftentimes a result of other variables, right? It wasn't just, if it was just physicians saying these drugs are dangerous, we might have had more of a public health framework. But coming from the United States, and the United States shaping this, our own particular moralism characterized the evolution of this regime. And so